Greetings, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to this session of the Generative AI Teaching Conversation webinar series. My name is Sean Leahy. I am the Director of Creative and Emerging Technologies at Enterprise Technology here at ASU. And I'll be your host today. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to the Provost Office for hosting this 30-minute engaging conversation with our expert panelists from ASU to provide an opportunity for our faculty, staff, and students to engage in a contemporary and emergent discussion around the use of generative AI in higher education. And I just want to send another just quick short note for all of our members in the audience today. If you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A tools in Zoom. And we will try to save a few moments at the end of our session here today to address those questions. And also for our panelists, if there are questions that come up, please feel free to respond to them as you see fit. And so for today's topic, we will be exploring the question, in what ways can generative AI impact critical thinking, research, and writing? And of course, to do that, I am joined by a wonderful panel here from our experts at ASU here. So first off, I'd like to introduce Katina Michael. Katina is a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence at ASU. She is a senior global future scientist, director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective, and founding chair of the Masters of Public Interest Technology. She is also the founding editor-in-chief of the IEEE Transactions on Technology and Society, and senior IEEE member in the Society for the Social Implications of Technology. Welcome back, Katina.
Thank you for having me, Sean.
Absolutely. Next up, we have Punya Mishra. Punya is the Associate Dean of Scholarship and Innovation at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at ASU, where he leads multiple initiatives providing a future-forward, equity-driven, collaborative approach to educational research. He is internationally recognized for his work in educational technology, creativity, and the application of design to educational innovation. Welcome back, Punya.
Thanks, Sean. Good to be here.
And then to round out our panel, we are welcoming back Ted Pavlich. Ted is the Associate Professor in the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence and the School of Life Sciences. He was the founding associate director of research for the Biomimicry Center at ASU and continues to be closely associated with the center. His research focuses on understanding adaptive decision-making strategies in autonomous systems. To this end, his laboratory does empirical work with natural systems, such as social insect colonies, and does engineering work building decision-making algorithms for artificial systems, such as decentralized energy management systems for the built environment. Welcome back, Ted.
Hi, great to be here. Thanks.
All right. So to get things kicked off, well, first of all, I'm so thrilled to have all three of you back together in the same. I think this band just simply could not break up with the deserved encore. So welcome back. And I'm hoping and looking forward to the fact that I hope we can just kind of jump off right where we left off last week. As we've been discussing in this conversation series over the past couple of weeks, we've been exploring high-level overview of what generative AI tools are, how they're being used. And last week, specifically, we were exploring how we can foster a positive culture around the use of these tools and the considerations associated with issues of academic integrity and things of that nature. And broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say that generative AI presents a potential for tremendous benefits such as increased productivity, enhanced creativity, and more efficient iterative processes. However, the use of generative AI tools can also pose potential risks or challenges in certain contexts or situations. So today I'm thrilled to join our panelists to explore those potential impacts of generative AI tools on critical thinking, research, and writing. And to do that, first, Katina, if I could sort of turn to you, I'm gonna lob out a question here for you to get our panel all excited and hyped up and ready to go. When we kind of bring this question up, right? So what are the effects of generative AI tools on critical thinking, research, and writing? I'd really be curious to get your input and your thoughts around that. I mean, for example, would generative AI, do we see this as being sort of a symbiotic relationship, pervasive in all aspects of our lives, or or is it more discrete? What are your thoughts on these potential effects or impacts of the generative AI tools on critical thinking and research and writing?
That's a great question, Sean. I mean, let's define critical thinking to begin with. And, according to the Oxford Dictionary, it's the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. And the question we're thinking about is, can generative AI assist us, help us in that human-machine symbiosis and configuration to make a decision or a judgment about something objectively. And the question is all about sources in AI, because everything is based on data. So data is driving the response of the generative AI. Can we trust the data source? Do we know the vintage of the data source? Has that data source been peer reviewed? Will it give us the right kind of information back? But in terms of ways of thinking, I guess that's what differentiates a human from a bot. The capacity to have new ways of thinking in an infinite way, not a limited way, and also to make a judgment call about something, to understand whether it's right, wrong, whether we have gone halfway to addressing the issue at hand, whether the problem we're actually seeking an answer for is a complex problem of which there is no answer. But if 10 people put in the same question, exactly the same question into a generative AI, most likely they will get the same response if it's based on the same data source, if you're using the same application. So the question then becomes, how do you know what you don't know? And ChatGPT, for example, version 4 might well provide for you a list of sources you're unaware of, but not all of these can be validated. We know, for example, that bogus references have come up in search in ChatGPT. How do we differentiate between disinformation and the real authentic information that's been peer reviewed? So in a nutshell, sometimes it can help in our thinking process, but I don't think it's a good analytical or evaluative tool at the moment to help us make a judgment. But do I think we will be using it just like we're using Google search or just like we use library databases at ASU? Definitely. I think it'll be a starting point for exploration. But in terms of what makes us human, that element that will influence critical thinking, I think that's why we're human. And I think that's how we can work well with generative AI.
Yeah, Punya or Ted, what are your thoughts about this question?
I do think it's a great point that that these AI tools are really reflections and aggregations of us, but ultimately, you know, at certain important points, we do need to come up with new ideas, and we like to think that, you know, although there is, you know, nothing new under the sun, so it's said, there have to be at least some points of inspiration that go beyond what the tools will give us. And so I do think these tools will really greatly increase our productivity, but like Katina said, it's really hard to take the human out of the machine and still expect the machine to sort of, you know, be able to do everything that we need it to do without at least a little bit of supervision, and ultimately that, you know, that hierarchy I think is always going to be there.
So if I can follow up on that, I think one of the things that is impressive about these tools, I mean, and what is weak about them, right? So what's weak about them, we've talked about, they tend to hallucinate. They are dependent on the information that's been put into them, which is why you can, depending on, I mean, if it's been trained on Reddit and 4chan, you're going to get a certain kind of AI responses to, you know, very simple questions. But there's another side to it as well, which is, you know, which is very surprising to most people when they first encounter these generative AI models, how good it is at genre mashing, right? So you can say, can you give me a poem in the style of Shakespeare about washing socks in a dryer? And it will do that. And so what it's doing, so there is some level of abstraction that is happening in these models, where it's then creating this prose where it can mash up these different genres, right? And so I think that can be a tool for idea generation, right? And so because one of the ways that we think about creativity is sort of combinatorial creativity, where we take ideas from different fields and we mush them together, and we generate a lot of those, and some hold water and others don't, and that's okay, right? That's where I think our critical thinking, our expertise comes in. So that's why I think that if we think about this, you know, and I'm going to make a plug for our podcast, Sean, the Learning Futures podcast, because we had Chris Dede on there, and what, you know, from Harvard, and what Chris talked about was the idea, instead of AI, of IA, which is talking about intelligence augmentation. And I think that as these tools become ubiquitous and become part of our sort of toolkit overall, that we can start seeing it that way, which is like, can I take these things and say, give me 13 different ideas about X? Right? Another person who's going to be on the podcast soon is Ethan Malik from the Wharton School. And he uses that to say, give me ideas for business ideas for X, Y, and Z. And it comes up, it spits out its own form of garbage, right? But in that garbage, that's where we come in. That's where our expertise comes in and say, oh, here are some nuggets or ideas that I can build on. And I think so thinking about these as tools which augment our intelligence, that augment our creativity, don't give us the right answer necessarily. But I think that's where I think sort of the media literacy and critical literacy has to play a very important role. Because I met this guy at a party like a couple of weeks ago where he's like, oh my God, ChatGPT knows everything. I'm like, no, it doesn't. And I couldn't disabuse him of that, right? Because Google and AI and Microsoft and OpenAI are behind it, it must be true. I think that's the thing that we have to be wary of. But I think that we should also not sort of ignore sort of the values that it can give us as well. So I think it's a two-way street, as with most technologies.
Yeah.
I just want to add a little bit to that is that, in engineering, we often use the term cognitive ergonomics, and, things are more cognitively ergonomic. So not only, we talk about, a lot of people talk about ergonomics, it's actually the way, it's good for your spine or those sorts of things. But, and I think that, editing, for example, is often more sort of cognitively ergonomic than generation at first principle. So I think this idea of, I'm going to throw in a weird prompt, I don't quite know how to mash it up, and then I'm going to edit the heck out of whatever comes out of it. That I just think we talk about physical models being transitional objects for our mental models. And that's exactly what I think that these statistical models are, is they help us do something in our head that we can't quite do, just so we can see it out in the real world and then play with it, then play the heck out of it. And then so that we can so it really enables our creativity, because it's more of an impedance match between, what we're somehow engineered to do and what, we actually now can do. So we're finally bringing those two together, and that's very promising.
Yeah, Ted, I think that's an interesting point, because I was just having a conversation, I think it was yesterday, with somebody about some of the artistic processes of using some of the image generators. And one of the, again, kind of tacking on that idea of prompt engineering and how do you but one of the things that was interesting is if just sort of evaluate the creative process of using that AI tool, one would be, having to really heavily envision what it was you wanted the output to be, and then thinking, how do you give it the right constraints and controls and likenesses to really sort of steer it into what you were trying to do, which is a real interesting, way of sort of approaching those tools and those technologies. So I think that's a really interesting space. I do want to so let me kind of shift the question a little bit here. And Ted, I'll kind of come back to you here to get your take to start this sort of response off. But, while we often find ourselves sort of caught up in the excitement and the news cycles of the headlines of the most popular generative AI tools, right, from big tech companies, big players in the generative AI space like OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, I think there's a question here to explore what is the lifespan or what is the development of large language models or other generative AI tools that are making their way, if not already, into so many other aspects of our digital lives. For example, like I know I have Stable Diffusion running on my iPad, for example. But do you think, like, in essence, will there be a time that we'll be able to escape, even if we try to? Will we be able to avoid using these AI tools, or do you think this will become so ubiquitous that everything we touch, everything we type will be starting to leverage some aspect of these generative AI tools moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do think that there is some inevitability that if you're already using something that's involving content creation in a digital format, it's going to be hard to resist adding features just because the APIs are so available. The awareness is out there, and we're seeing it. We already know that we have text completion tools built into our email clients and everything already. If you go into, even before these large language models became very popular, you could go into Microsoft PowerPoint, and if you knew where to hit, you could say, generate a 13-slide template for something on any subject you wanted, and it did a pretty decent job of laying out, a template that you could then fill in. And now, there's that icons button in PowerPoint where you can start typing in things and it will automatically search over images that that are licensed so that you can use them in your presentation. And it's only, you know, maybe weeks away probably from when you can start typing in things, and it'll then, you know, shell out to DALL-E or something like that and just generate those images. So, you know, it makes me wonder about, you know, there are a lot of people who make their money off of stock art, like, you know, drawing clip art and things like that. I think, you know, clip art is just going to start becoming something that's totally automated and not something that humans do. But you'll guide the creation of clip art. It'll sort of democratize clip art production, I guess. There was an evolutionary biologist like about 10 years ago, Joan Slonczewski, I think, who came up with this idea of, so there's Kurzweil had this singularity idea, this technological singularity that we couldn't see beyond. And she said, well, I don't think that's quite right. I think it's going to be more like a mitochondrial singularity, where there's this point where all of the intelligence will become in the AI and humans will be pulled in just to power the AI or something like that. And I don't think that's necessarily where we're going, but I do think this idea of endosymbiosis, this idea that the data is being from humans and all the biases are being pulled into the AI, and the humans and AI are sort of, you know, coming together. I mean, it's kind of like, like we don't have fur anymore, right? We have clothes instead. And so we just never exist without clothes unless we're in very, very special situations. And I think, yeah, it will eventually be that way, where, you know, already it is, you download a keyboard app for Android or iPhone, and if you type a message to someone, your wife or your husband, you can quickly say, wait, is my tone okay? Why don't you just clean up my tone? And then it'll automatically do that for you. Or you can actually say, look at the conversation so far. What do you think I should say next? And it'll just come up with a response for you. And so it's really easy to do. And I think it's just going to keep coming in, and people will just get, you know, trained in it the same way that Gen Z right now sort of speaks with different character sets than my generation. The next generation is going to speak very differently.
So if I can add this, you know, that we have been living in a world of AI for a while now. You know, I think we should, if you think, I mean, yes, these generative models are sort of new, but in some ways, if you look at all the algorithms that are feeding us our information, what YouTube, you know, things are recommended, whether it's Amazon's recommendation engine and so on, we have been living in this world. I mean, it just has become something very salient in the last few months because of these large, you know, language models. But I think it's also important to recognize that we have been in that world for a long time, and it is just a continuous progression of that. I mean, if you think about 1905 or 7 or 12, I think was when the first, you know, diode sort of thing was made. And now a chip is in everything, right? We have chips in microwaves, cars, you name it. I don't think you can think of any device now which you use which doesn't have microchips in it. And so I think we have been living in a world of AI, and this has just made that come to the forefront, brought some, I mean, and I like this conversation because it brings these challenges and issues to the forefront, which had sort of become invisible to us. We didn't realize that, you know, we were living in this world which was controlled to a large extent by software algorithms making decisions for us, you know. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and I'd be curious too, like, so one thing I kind of wanted to call back and connect some dots here. So Katina, kind of coming back to one of your, both yours and Ted's points also previously about, you know, the APIs are all over the place, but also not knowing about, you know, what is that data set? Who has vetted that data set? Where is it coming from? What do you think about the challenges, for example, of like these large language models or other generative AI tools essentially being controlled by like the big 5 or the big 3 tech companies? Do you see some of those potential challenges if, for example, Ted, to your point, like whether it's a keyboard application for, you know, a mobile device, but if everything starts using more centralized sort of AI models, like, do you foresee that being a challenge versus a more federated, like open ecosystem where people are creating, I mean, I know I personally was really pleased to see, you know, after the initial success of DALL-E, sort of an open source stable diffusion coming along. But I'm kind of curious what the panel thinks about some of those issues of Like who's putting their hand on the scale with these large models?
Look, I'm a fan of the whole series so far, Sean, and we've alluded to some of these aspects as we've gone along. Ted mentioned something amazing in the last talk where he said it's a public good. You know, if we put it behind a paywall, we talked about access, affordability, inclusivity. We talked about who's generating the data, who has the rights to the data, what quality of GPT, for example, or generative AI you may have access to. And we talked about public interest technology. But certainly, if we are using a public good and everyone is asking the same questions, as many of us do, for example, in flu season, if we have flu symptoms, we'll go to Google and we'll search. And we know some of the issues that arose in 2008 and beyond that when the algorithm was revised, anticipating a flu season or a flu outbreak or a mini epidemic or something, that the systems don't always get it right. So we're all either believing the wrong thing, and as we fine tune these apps and tools, they get better and they will continue to get better. But what if we're all believing the same thing? You know, are we all going to have the same response to a question that's posed in society? And this is, we're seeing, you know, I'm in front of the Cronkite School here in Phoenix, but we want diversity of opinion. If we're all talking the same way and we are all robotic because we believe ChatGPT, then, you know, it's a bit of a boring life. And who influences those airwaves will influence our sentiment and will influence our mental models. Ted has spoken at length on mental models. So the question I have is, do we really want to become robotic in some way? You know, and how many crazy things can we ask the generative AI before it becomes nonsensical? Before we go away from those grand challenges we're facing, such as sustainability, and come back to the real emphasis here. So I don't want us to water down the critical issues by recombining things that really don't make sense and we shouldn't even be bothering with. And sure, you don't know what you don't know. So, you know, ideate all you want. But I also don't want us to be communicating via email or whatever communication mechanism we have in 50 years' time, all sounding the same, because it'll become boring and we are spontaneous. That's what makes us human, spontaneity of response. That's how we connect with others. And if we lose that spontaneity, I think we're going to lose the connection.
Yeah. Well, that was incredibly well said. This is why we collect these amazing panelists to join us in these conversations. This is the gold we get. And Katina, I think that also kind of also transitions nicely sort of into this last sort of question to pose. And so Punya, maybe if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could take a stab at answering this first. But again, as we approach these tools, you know, what is sort of our responsibility to approach them with caution, and to carefully consider those like just as Katina was mentioning, do we run the risk of losing what it is to be human by leveraging or leaning too heavily on certain tools or these kind of things? And what impacts might that have on just, again, our creative, our writing, our academic processes?
So, you know, one of the things that, you know, that just to touch on something that was mentioned before, I think in a previous episode as well, you know, when we talk about this idea of a public good, I think we really need to think about sort of the broader economic models that are running these things, because, you know, these companies can come and go, but underlying that, if it is shareholder profit and so on, then there is going to be certain kinds of uses of these technologies which are going to feature more, you know, so it's going to be an advertising model which has to do with keeping eyeballs and, you know, keeping you engaged. And we know how that ended up when it came to YouTube and when it came to other social media, which sort of pushed you more into more and more niche, radical sort of ideas just to hold you there for longer periods of time. And this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that these language models have, which is the price of creating BS effectively dropped to zero. Right. And we know what happened when, let's say, email and, you know, the ability to take computerized phone calls, what that led to, it led to a lot of spam. It led to a lot of scam artists trying to trick people and fool people. We have this misinformation and we have fake news and where the idea of truth itself is under discussion, right? You know, is this true or that? We saw that during the COVID pandemic. And so I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges that we are going to face as a society, is when the price of creating information which looks very genuine. Just before the show started, we were talking about this video that I made of myself, which is the the words were created by GPT. The voice was trained on 11 labs. It sort of messed up my accent, which was kind of interesting in and of itself. And then I just uploaded a photo of me, and it has made a believable video of me spouting words that I never said, right? And so that's me playing an experiment. There are characters out there who have not the best of intentions about, humanity and so on, right? I mean, so I think that's going to be one of the things that we have to really think about in terms of media literacy. To me, that's going to be one of the biggest challenges. And the thing with media literacy, the concern I've had with most discussions of it is that we're focused on the media, but really it needs to focus on the psychology of us, right? That how we tend to anthropomorphize these chatbots, because it kicks in our theory of mind, and we start ascribing personality and agency and thoughts and beliefs and desires to it. And it's an instinctual response. We have to learn that that's happening, that confirmation bias, that, that we will seek out information which confirms our thing. Now, again, these tools can be used productively. So if you get an idea, you can ask it, what are some 3 ways that this idea could be wrong? But that requires you to understand that you have a confirmation bias, that we as humans tend to do that. So to me, that's where it's going to get really interesting, and where I think, as I'm in a college of education, so I'm always thinking of it in terms of what it means from an educator's perspective. And I think that we need to be starting thinking about, and there's a broader social thing, but again, our children are going to live in this world. As Ted said, this is a part of the air that we breathe today, has been for a while, and is only going to be more so. So those are kinds of things that really sort of make me think about what we can do and how we can educate around these tools.
Yeah, wonderful. Ted or Katina, do you have anything to kind of add to that, or?
Well, I do, just before, because we're going to go around to a close, because it came up, and I think Katina made some comments about, if 10 people ask the same question, you get the same response, and, it adds sort of a weird centralization to our cognitive processes, and also an opportunity for other, third parties to get involved in shaping things. And I, if we're talking about podcasts and webinars and things like that, I just want to give a plug for, there was an episode of Radio Lab, sort of award-winning kind of science-y podcast that is sort of related to, public radio listeners will be familiar with it, called The Wooby Effect, that came out, I think, 2 years ago. So before ChatGPT was a thing, but it was all about how predictive text algorithms were working in China as they struggled with the ability to type Chinese characters using the QWERTY keyboard. And it's a beautiful episode, because a lot of these same issues come up, because in the end, they had to come up with significant text prediction capabilities that were actually influenced by the news. And so the next word that was predicted would not just come from a static database, it would come from current events. So that provided an opportunity for the government to get involved and actually affect everyone's writing everywhere. So so these same issues that we're talking about now, other people have been talking about in other contexts that maybe us, those of us who are Westerners may not be as familiar with, but I definitely think it's a great episode to check out if you're interested in these things.
Yeah, amazing.
I'm just going to say, lastly, data sources will be the biggest new thing. And if we want to sense communities at the local level, or sense cities to organize data-driven innovations within those cities and to know more about our cities, we will be listening to conversations through surveillance lampposts for good, allegedly. We will be collecting information within corporate environments or universities as meetings are going on, and those actions that are never followed up, there will be prompts for those actions through various chatbots, Slack, or any other platform. But we're going to be sensing, and we can do that through audio, visual recording, and other kinds of capture. But sensors will be the big thing. The question will be whether we have policies in place, privacy understanding and context that matters to people, and people's rights are upheld. But I think we're going to be looking for new sources of evidence, because the data we have in existence at the moment, that the assets are trawling through and generating in the millions of lines, and databases are being filled all over the world in cloud systems, they're not really the things that we need. That's not going to help us with sustainability exactly. It's just the data that's generated by machines. We've got to ask the question, what data do we use? What data do we need? And what data do we have access and rights to? And for how long? And that's going to be a revolution in itself. But we haven't got that conversation there. And that's actually more important than the apps being created at the moment.
Yeah. Oh, that's a wonderful place to leave too, because we can leave a kind of a cliffhanger there. One other just quick aside was having conversations too around this idea, right? If we're using all these generative tools to create new content based on existing content, at some point, do we end up in a recursive, like, swirling vortex of confusion? I don't know. Maybe that's a topic for a future episode here. And I just wanted to say thank you to Ted who was handling the questions that were coming up in the Q&A very expeditiously. So thank you, Ted, for addressing those comments. So with that, again, the 30 minutes has come and gone lightning quick, as it seems to always do. So just Punya, Katina, Ted, thank you again so much for spending your time with us today, joining us and sharing in these wonderful conversations that are really helping to demystify and kind of work through this whirlwind generative AI topic that we have all found ourselves in. And so on behalf of myself and the entire panel here with us today, I just want to say thank you for joining our generative AI teaching conversation. Special thank you to Mackenzie Ramirez and Allison Hall, who have been joining us working in the background of Zoom to make sure everything runs smoothly for everybody. We hope you've enjoyed your time with us today. And if you're interested in learning more, please check the events calendar for future webinars and for previously recorded sessions. And again, thank you very much. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day wherever you find yourself. And until next time, thanks, everyone.